What's up everyone? Welcome to Bluff Coast. My name is Eric and today we're going to be continuing a little series that we have going on about my Subaru Swap in my 1987 Volkswagen Vanagon Westfalia. Today I'm going to be covering how I got my Subaru donor car. This was a pretty overwhelming step for me at first because there's so many options for Subarus out there. There's so many different years, there's so many different models, and I wasn't quite sure what was most compatible with the Vanagon specifically. When I first started looking at Subaru swaps, I noticed people kind of use early 2000s engines roughly, and then obviously you have the 2.2 liter option or the 2.5 liter option for the Subaru engines. I noticed most people use the 2.2 liters for California swaps because they're smog legal, and then there's also the 2.5 liter options for people who don't live in California. I live in Iowa where we do not have any emission tests or anything like that, so I decided to go with the 2.5 liter just because I could have a little bit more power, and I liked the overall idea of having a little bit newer engine. When I initially started my search, I would say I was ideally looking for a Subaru that had been either wrecked or rusted out, had roughly around 100,000 miles, basically the fewer the better. And ideally I wanted to be able to find something that I could hear run. This way I was able to tell what it sounded like, if there was any ticking or knocking, and just kind of what to expect once it was actually into my van. A few questions that I personally had right off the bat were what years of Subarus were most compatible with my van. Should I get a 2.2 liter or a 2.5 liter? Is a certain engine type easiest to swap or most compatible? And then does it matter if it's an automatic or manual transmission donor car? And then another thing I've kind of been figuring out as I go is what kind of work is needed to be done on the Subaru before it goes into my van. So basically what I ended up figuring out was that 2000 to 2004 EJ25 motors are the most compatible with the Vanagon specifically, and it doesn't matter if it's automatic or manual transmission Subaru, either one can be configured to work with your van. These engines are EJ25s, so they are a 2.5 liter Subaru. They typically are drive-by cable, non-EGR, and single overhead cam engines. All of that may be foreign to some of you might know what that means. Basically, the throttle cable connects to the engine like a normal Vanagon does via a cable versus a electrical wire that some of the newer Subaru models have. And then they also don't have EGR for the most part, which is an emissions system, I guess you could call it, on an engine. I don't know that much about EGR, but typically engines from 2000 to 2004 Subarus do not have EGR. Some of them do in the 2004 range, I believe. But EGR is something that can definitely be worked around. Some people prefer it, I've heard. Others just think it's a lot more simple to do it without EGR. And then also the fact that they're single overhead cam. This makes it more simple. I don't know the exact science or anything behind it, but typically single overhead cam engines are typically used for the Vanagon swaps. I've seen double overhead cams on different Volkswagen swaps, but for the most part, most people put single overhead cam engines in theirs. So all of this info that I had kind of sent me on a wild goose chase to find a good Subaru donor on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. And we found a really good 2004 Subaru Outback that had 84,000 miles on it. So I actually ended up going to Cedar Rapids the day that I found it. I had messaged the lady on Facebook and told her pretty much that we would take it because it just seemed like a super good deal. I got that for $2,000. I thought that was going to be the engine that I was going to put in my van. After all, we actually ended up keeping this vehicle as one of our daily drivers. It was just in way too good of condition. When we decided that we weren't going to take the engine out of this one and put it in my van, that obviously led me to just kind of keep looking. So one thing I did was just visit some local places that had Subarus for sale, and I would just kind of test drive them, check them out, listen to how they sound, listen to how they run, and just to kind of get an idea for what to expect out of a good engine and kind of how they all differ. This led me to our next engine that I bought, which was an engine out of a 2000 Subaru Legacy that had been wrecked. So a guy had it up for sale on Facebook. He was selling just the engine. So I messaged him about it, and he said that he had just done the timing and heads on it like 1,000 miles ago before it was wrecked. So it just seemed like a super good deal. I didn't really know much at the time, and looking back, I maybe shouldn't have bought it. I was not able to hear the engine run, and that was kind of one of the main reasons that I decided to not end up use this one for my swap specifically. I kind of had to take the guy's word for it on how many miles that were roughly on it, which was supposedly around 100K. So all in all, I decided to not use this engine for my van, but I do still have it, and I do plan to keep it just for parts and maybe to eventually rebuild and put in my van further down the road. And it was also fun hauling it around in my van. So the first two donors that I bought didn't end up working out like I thought. That led me to the third vehicle that I ended up buying, which was another 2000 Subaru Outback that a guy had up for sale not far from my hometown. And I messaged him on Facebook Marketplace because he was parting it out. And I had asked him about a few different parts on it because initially I was going to be using the previous engine that I talked about. If I was going to be using that engine, I needed wiring from a different vehicle, specifically wiring and an intake manifold so they would be compatible. So he basically ended up telling me that I could have the whole car with the engine for $400. So it seemed like a pretty good deal. This engine did have 185,000 miles on it, but it did run. I could hear it run. So that ended up being kind of one of the big factors that led me to use this engine. Which obviously it didn't have an exhaust system on it, so it sounded a little bit whack, but overall the engine sound was really nice. It was really smooth. No leaks or anything like that coming from the heads. We trailered it back to the garage that I've been working in, and I got to work on ripping the wiring out of it first. I'll be covering that process a lot more in detail in another video down the road. I'm going to be redoing the head gaskets, and I'm also going to be doing the timing belt, of course. Obviously, Subarus last quite a long time if they're treated right and maintained well. Obviously, the lower miles that it has is technically better, but for the most part, any Subaru engine that you're going to be putting in a Volkswagen is probably going to need some work before it goes in. So if you know that the seals have been redone, it's been kind of freshened up. The mileage doesn't mean everything, but typically lower miles is a little bit better. So overall, this was a pretty overwhelming process at first, but I'm really happy with how it all turned out. I love looking for vehicles for sale, so finding my donor engine was kind of a fun process for me. If you have any questions about finding a donor engine, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to answer any questions or help you find one. So as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all of those cool things. Any questions you might have, I would love to answer them. So leave them down below in the comments. I hope to see you on the road eventually. And as always, don't forget to stay coasting. Peace.